Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Tuesday, April 16th, 2024. I'm John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Media commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
And senior editor Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John.
So as Donald Trump was being, the first day of Donald Trump's trial in the hush money case began in lower Manhattan, about 350 yards away. There was a protest, not of Trump, but of Israel, that then moved on to the Brooklyn Bridge, shutting down the Brooklyn Bridge. And Abe, give me a sense of what happened at that protest and at protests on was it the Golden Gate or Bay Bridge?
The Golden Gate and
Golden
Chicago.
Gate.
Golden Gate Bridge was traffic was stopped for like 5 hours.
Right. And the approaches or entrances to O'Hare Airport and the SeaTac Airport in Seattle.
Yeah, so from the footage that I've seen and the reporting and the pictures, it seems as if that little glimpse we saw of Al-Quds Day in Dearborn, Michigan, where pro-Hamas protesters were screaming death to America and death to Israel and whatever else has kind of infected the larger anti-Israel protest movement here. There was someone carrying a Hezbollah flag at the protest in Manhattan yesterday. There were chants of death to America on the Brooklyn Bridge. This is New York City, out in the open. And it's becoming increasingly normalized on the side of the anti-Israel left.
Well, Hezbollah is a designated terrorist organization, so I hope our friendly neighborhood FBI is looking into all of the people who were waving Hezbollah flags and chanting Hezbollah anti-American slogans, because that is the job of the FBI, is in part to look into and investigate operative terrorist cells in the United States. I'm struck by how useless these protests really are and how frustrating they are to the average citizen. I know this is a rant I often make, but especially the approaches to airports. There was some interesting video footage of the people who had to get out of their cars at O'Hare, dragging their luggage behind them, trying to walk the whatever half mile that was left to get to the terminal to try to make their flight. And they were furious, correctly so. They were flipping off the protesters, screaming at them, and the cops were just sitting there letting the protesters hang out. Now, I know on the Golden Gate Bridge, they did eventually arrest some people who had chained themselves to barrels and left their cars there, so that there were some arrests, but they tend to paper these people and release them the same day. There need to be genuine prosecutions and punishment for people who stop everyday, ordinary people's lives across the country in this way. This is not a First Amendment right. You do not have a right to disrupt traffic and to block airports. You're not allowed to do that. That's against the law. But they are not being, they face no real punishment, so they just keep doing it.
Yeah, as
they arrested about 40 in Chicago, too. They arrested a bunch of the O'Hare people, right. Apparently. 31 women and 9 men. So make of that what you will, the gender disparity there.
But as it stands now, because the arrests and the releases are so immediate, these people want to be arrested. That's like the ultimate goal.
They get social media clout for it.
Yeah,
yes, exactly correct. Yes.
Well, then the question is, do they want to get arrested, or is the provocation here an effort to, in the American context, martyr themselves? Like, they want to get arrested, but that's probably not good enough. These protests are designed, in my view, to be so annoying, so disruptive, so unpleasant, and so awful that at some point violence is going to break out. Like, I mean, we have road rage in America all the time. Granted, if you're like, you need to get to your flight, you don't really have time to stop and, go up to somebody's car and smash in his window, or, go up to somebody with your suitcase and smash them over the head with your suitcase, or that cops who are getting screamed at in the face as they stand, in front of the mob on a bridge, that somebody doesn't crack and just, take out a nightstick and smash somebody in the head. That is purpose 101 in the world of the radical leftist protester. They want to incite a violent attack on them or a violent response to them so that they can then say, help, help, I'm being oppressed, like the guy in Monty Python and the Holy Grail. And I am starting to get real whiffs of the anti-war movement in the United States in the late 60s. Although since everything is sped up because of social media and because it's, every news is instantaneous and all of that. So all of this started on October 8th, right? So it's now 6 months pretty much since October 8th. The the anti-war movement, which began in part very similar to the sort of anti-war movement of post-October 7th, which began in an intellectual framework with papers, the Port Huron Statement at the University of Michigan, which is sort of an interesting fact since there was a huge disruption at the University of Michigan yesterday and the day before yesterday involving our friend Dan Senor in part, who was supposed to be interviewing former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, and the administration kept moving the event to smaller and more secret venues in order to prevent there from being violence. And in the end, like 75 people could get in and hear the former Prime Minister of the United States speaking in a secret room so that protesters couldn't come and storm it or something like that. Anyway, it started as this intellectualized movement. The Students for a Democratic Society was a college group, and started doing college-y things. And then there was the People's Park at Berkeley. And then there was a kind of let's just give peace a chance and the Summer of Love and all of this. And then as this went on, creeping in alongside were the more radical and more violent and more serious protesters who eventually started doing things like bombing recruitment facilities and making bombs and acts of terrorism, as Brian Burrows details in his book Days of Rage. 1,200 bombings took place domestically in the United States in 1971. So the violent part here hasn't happened yet. But what happened yesterday with these frank, open, pro-Hezbollah, terrorist displays, again, intending to cause a response sort of like the Chicago 1968 Democratic Convention, which the protests were designed to get Richard Daley to do exactly what he did, which is send the cops in to bash heads, and then we had 3 days of chaos.
But there has been I just one small correction. There has been some violence on the part of the pro-Palestinian protesters. A man was killed in California when he was attacked by one of the protesters. There have been Jewish students physically assaulted by Students for Justice in Palestine. And I think that, those little skirmishes get written off on by the mainstream media as just, kids being kids, or, things got a little out of hand. I think we should see them as canaries in the coal mine. Certainly the Democrats should be concerned about their convention this summer, but just in general, I think you're right, because there's a sense of license on the part of these protesters to engage in physical acts of violence.
There was an SDS sign, by the way, yesterday.
Oh, there was an SDS sign, right?
There was an SDS sign
on Center Street, yeah.
Yeah, and it was, instead of bring the war home, it was bring the genocide home.
Right. Huh. So my point here is, I think that what we're seeing is an acceleration. Things are happening very fast. Nothing is burning out. The kindling seems to be catching into a larger fire, and people need to be prepared for the fact that those isolated incidents where the 69-year-old man was smashed on the head by a professor of computer science at a local community college, not by some hippie who was on an LSD trip. That stuff really may be coming, and the summer's coming, and it's long hot summer. And what's striking to me is the last time we had an extended period of disorder in the summer of 2020, right? That was actually about something that happened in America, right? That was police, George Floyd, all of that. This is about something that has gone on in a country 9,000 miles away, and is an ally of the United States, does not involve the United States, and people are spoiling to create a civil war circumstance in the United States about something that, again, I mean, this is like a ridiculous thing to say, but at least the Vietnam War was something the United States was participating in. At least police violence.
Well, they would argue we're helping fund we send support to Israel. Ergo, we're involved. That would be their argument.
Yeah, right.
Also, it makes no difference to them that Gaza is quieter than it's been. That the fighting is quieter than it's been in a long time. They don't care. What's interesting here is that there's a different ideological flavor to the protesters today from the one that was guiding them, the protesters in the 60s, whereas in the 60s, they were shaped by their Marxist revolutionary heroes, and now they are embracing jihadist anti-Semitism, and that's going to continue to shape whatever comes of this, however this movement evolves. And I think that's a particularly scary prospect.
One other parallel, aside from this notion that you're taking your guidance from abroad, from, at least in the 60s, these were progressives following nominally radical progressive utopian ideologies in Cuba and China, Maoists, North Vietnam, which was viewed as a communist paradise. But one thing that they do have in common is, as with the Death to America stuff, how explicitly anti-American this is becoming. And so the question, the thing that Biden and the Democrats now have to be wary of, and they are responsible for its propagation and extension because of their coddling of it from November or December onward, is that it is going to turn back and bite them very significantly, that they are going to be seen to be courting a base of people who hate this country. And it's one thing to hate Israel, which most Americans do not. It's still the case. The last Gallup poll showed 51% of Americans support Israel, which is a pretty high number in America for anything. They don't hate Israel, but Israel is a secondary, tertiary issue for most people. But yelling death to America, at least, by the way, for anybody over 50, and the most reliable voters in the world are people over 50, conjures up 1979, 1980, Iran, the protests in Iran, when Iranians, interesting time to discuss this, were holding 52 American hostages in a sort of berserk display of revolutionary fervor and American impotence at the same time. So one thing to watch out for here is the valence of the protesters who have moved from, there's too much killing, there should be a ceasefire, all of which we understood as being disingenuous, but as a popular front mechanism, it's sort of understood. They're like, just have a what could be bad about a ceasefire? Then guns aren't firing, and guns are bad. And
although they had a moratorium on that when Iranian drones and missiles were directed at Israel the other day, so I just I didn't hear that.
No, but so the word
24
hours.
Hamas rejected a ceasefire like 16 hours ago. Also,
right, but if you actually think about that crew of people, the sort of AOC, the squad people, they stopped with the ceasefire now stuff a couple of months ago. And now they're just, Israel is committing genocide, right, and everything is terrible. And, people, Biden's going to lose Michigan and lose the presidency unless he does something different. But this shift to anti-America, to outright utter America hatred, is again, parallels the speed except for the speed, the general movement of the anti-war coalition that, I hate to say this, ended democratic leftist rule in the United States. I mean, in this sense, Lyndon Johnson was president of the United States. He had 69 Democratic senators after his landslide election in 1964. He passed Medicare, Medicaid, the Great Society, legislation, 79 bills of the Great Society legislation. But he was conducting the Vietnam War. Richard Nixon became president, and though Nixon was not exactly a conservative as a governing force, the agenda of progressive change in the United States came to an end in 1968, and we really did not see its surface again until 1993, when Clinton tried to do Clinton Care, or Hillary Care, then had his hat handed to him, and then not till 2008, when Obama won, was a person who described himself as a liberal elected president of the United States. So,
by the way, the other eerie parallels of who was running against LBJ in the primary that sort of nudged him out.
Yeah, was the most despised figure on the right for the American left.
And there's within the Democratic coalition, you had an RFK, sort of like sweeping up, by pure coincidence this year, there's genuine worry that RFK Jr. is going to railroad Biden.
But Nixon was the originating figure in many ways of the opinion of liberals about Republicans. The hatred of Nixon was universal. The idea that he was a slimy, tricky, mendacious monster, which I think he kind of turned out to be, but actually hadn't been before. He had just been a conventional California conservative politician who didn't like communists, and had gotten himself on the Eisenhower ticket for that reason. The 2-minute hate of every Republican since it originates with Nixon, and with Nixon in 68, and this blinding of liberal opinion and the liberal bubble to what might be attractive about such a person, and how they themselves are creating some of the attractions of the American people toward him because of their insane, outrageous, and excessive behavior. And now we have Trump running against Biden, and whatever you can say about Trump, he is not to blame for anything that is going on in the streets of America when people are shouting "Death to America." And so, they have walked themselves, they have nourished and coddled an opinion that the president has to take very seriously, this critical faction within the Democratic Party, rather than confronting it and trying to show his strength by refusing to kowtow to it. And now they're going to have a summer and a convention and a fall to deal with, exclusive of Trump and what they might be able to make the American people think about Trump.
And that's actually, it's a big question and a big weakness in their strategy if it comes to fruition, because as of now, what they're saying is, you might not like Biden. You might think you're worse off. You might think all of these things that the polls have been showing us that we've been until recently in denial about as Democratic strategists. But he's better than this guy. But if you're watching Biden's, people who identify as of the left burning American flags and shouting "Death to America," all Trump has to do is say, "I love this country." That's all he has to say. And if he's
literally hugs the flag,
yes,
right?
Yes. And his whole shtick is that he's saving the country and whatnot. Even, I know Trump is very challenging candidate, but that's a pretty powerful wedge in Biden's message that, at least I'm not that guy. No, you're the guy whose followers burn the flag.
We should note the university's role in all this also, again, as in the past, because the Death to America stuff, this anti-American stuff is coming alongside the decolonization trend, the fad of, decolonization and all that stuff. And that is, again, as we've said before, that all that stuff that they're saying about Israel would apply more clearly to the United States, and we know that they think that, right? We know that if they consider Israel a colonial.
Right. I mean, the last 5 years with this fad on the land acknowledgement, right? We acknowledge that our university sits. Of course, there's a bit of a fight on the left, you see, about what America's originating sin is, because America's originating sin is of course, racism. It's the 1619. America was built on slavery. And then you have this other argument. No, America was built on colonial expansion. And then of course, the 1619 Project people effectively say, no, you're stealing our victimization. We had it worse than you. We were enslaved. And they say, no, we were killed. And then the buffalo were destroyed. And I don't know what else. And this is the kind of the medieval scholastics arguments that are going on about the origin of the United States, where they start arguing about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. And everybody else at the university is desperately trying to enroll in economics classes so they can get a job after school. The Brown University Anthropology Department yesterday tweeted out that Biden must end the war in Gaza because a report in The Nation reveals how much military action contributes to global warming.
Yeah.
This is the Brown Anthropology Department. I don't know what anthropology has to do with climate change, but probably there are 15 people in the Brown Anthropology Department. I'm not joking about this, by the way. Look at liberal art, all of this stuff, which really became a liberal arts obsession. Look at the numbers at colleges of who's studying what, and see how the people who have embraced this most definitively are in departments that are effectively dead. Like, they have no graduate students, they have no undergraduates, no one's spending $75,000 a year to study anthropology anymore, unless you're rich and you can, and it's a luxury good. And so, here we are. So yeah, the universities are having this effect over here in the very elite culture, which then trickles down everywhere else. But
There's another point I want to make here, which is that, John, while you say correctly that everything is sped up now, everything sort of moves faster than it did in the 60s. Nevertheless, there's a kind of cycle that these movements have to go through before they fade away, and it's timed kind of terribly for Biden and the Democrats here with the election coming up. I don't think there's enough time to get through the cycle, which is first something very radical comes up, and there's a sort of spasm, and then conventional liberals decide that it's good, it's nice, it's mostly peaceful. However, even though everyone is seeing with their own eyes how terrible it is, I'm thinking here, of course, of the 2020 anti-police riots, and also in a different area, but I think the transradicalism, same thing, where this is good. These people are being seen for the first time. These children are being saved. Okay, and then the widespread acceptance of this among liberals creates a disaster, as in the case with the defunding of the police or the hobbling of the police. Huge spike in violent crimes in cities, is the case with the radical trans movement. Whole untold numbers of children on puberty blockers and being operated on, and other drugs that are untested, and all that psychological damage going on. And both those are in different phases right now. So once the conventional liberals see the damage that the thing that they had said was mostly peaceful has wrought, then they back away from it. And that's happened more significantly with the anti-cop movement. I think we're at the end of we're nearing the end of the mostly peaceful phase with the radical trans movement. As you see, England has completely changed its policy of affirmative trans care on kids after a bunch of studies have shown that it's actually very dangerous. But this one, the pro-Hamas movement, we're just at the start of the mostly peaceful phase. So it has to cycle through the disaster and then the walk back. That's a lot to get through by November.
And that's by the way, bringing up the trans thing is very interesting because before this, the last genocide we had protests over was the supposed trans genocide. And that's what I've been thinking of lately, is that there's a certain amount of that's how you can tell that a certain part of this protest movement begins from an anti-American position and stays there, not just that it adopts it along the way. That there's a certain part of it that will always see America as the chief oppressor, and the genocide is whatever policies are no biological males allowed in a high school girls' locker room becomes trans genocide. And right. So there's a sort of ridiculousness to some of these things, but it jumps immediately.
Same thing with the Black Lives Matter rhetoric. That was the police were genocidaires. It was a black genocide. Yeah.
Right. There's an America hating core to this that will always show up in these movements. No matter what they're ostensibly focused on or who starts the movement itself. So there's this sort of roving core of anti-Americanism.
Right. And remember that it was 2020, after the election of 2020, which now everybody focuses on the fact that, Biden won by 7 million, Trump had this fit, right? And, people forget that Republicans picked up 15 seats in the House, and 3 or 4 days after the Republicans picked up 15 seats in the House in this election, that Biden won by 7 million votes. There was a meeting of the House Democratic Caucus, and Abigail Spanberger from Virginia screamed at the squad and at her radical colleagues and said, "This is your fault. You did this with this psychotic police rhetoric. Get a hold of yourself. You are going to destroy this party." And that's the reckoning, Abe, that you talked about. And they did. Like in that case, they backed off pretty significantly off it's not really defund. We want to redirect, whatever.
Not only that, and then you start to see liberal mayors saying, this BS has got to stop. We've got to retake our city.
Right. You had recalls of prosecutors.
London Breed and all of that. Right.
And homicide rates are down in many major cities.
And by the
way,
it is important also to note, and this is very big, I think, because Rick Scott, the senator from Florida, tweeted this out very proudly and all that. But where are these protests? Where are the protests that happened yesterday? They're in New York City, in Manhattan, with a DA that busts felony charges down to misdemeanors unless your name is Donald Trump, in which case you bust up a misdemeanor charge into a felony unjustly and in a way that is probably going to embarrass you.
And prosecutes people who are defending themselves or others when criminals are attacking them. I mean, that's the other thing about him.
Right. But will not prosecute misdemeanors. So blocking a bridge is going to be a misdemeanor. It's a free call. It's a free shot. San Francisco, Bay Bridge. Okay, so there's no, radical, real, we don't have the son of a terrorist running the DA's office in San Francisco anymore, but there's still plenty radical. You're not going to get arrested. Illinois, Brandon Johnson, mayor of Chicago. the highway approaches in Cook County, I'm not quite sure what his jurisdiction is over that area particularly, but of course nobody gets arrested and charged in Chicago, and nobody gets arrested and charged in Washington State. Try it in Mississippi. Try it in Texas. Yesterday there was a protest somewhere in Florida, and the cops were dragging people by their feet.
You love to see it.
So what you're seeing also
immediately, by the way, that's
immediately.
The immediate.
They didn't sit there for
descend
hours.
on it immediately. Don't let it turn into people have to get out of their cars, walk a mile to the rental car spot to catch a tram to the main hangar at Chicago O'Hare.
Yeah, the key thing, and this was the Smamberger thing, and this is actually what might be the case with Biden, might explain Trump's defiance of his of the numbers that one would expect given the 4 cases against him and everything else. Is we're not going to know this until November, but for all we know, Biden has already lost this election because of stuff like this. Now granted, it didn't kill him in 2020, the protests. A lot of us thought that maybe
he was seen as the moderate in that. I mean, remember, he was the leavening influence in the party.
Okay, right. So he's standing there while all this is happening, doing nothing, rhetorically supporting or sharing in some of the rhetoric that is engaged in by the protest movement.
Certainly his vice president was, his vice presidential nominee was. Yes.
But I mean, and so if this becomes a major thing, there's only one guy to blame. You could sort of blame Trump for some of the stuff in 2020, right? I mean, he was president, it was COVID, everything was crazy. He was unsteady. Nobody felt solid or secure or comfortable. It's not like you could turn to Trump and say, I know what he's going to do, because he wasn't even doing it. Like he didn't call out the national, he didn't, call out the army or do whatever Tom Cotton suggested he do in some of these cases. And so he wasn't much of an answer to it either. But now he is totally not implicated in any of this, and Biden is fully implicated. And I don't think that we're anywhere near the end of this. This is maybe
also because
the end of the beginning, and then we're going to be in the middle phase.
Also because there's Israel's clock, right? Israel still has to go. Israel still has.
Right. I mean, that's the thing. We were talking yesterday about this. When Matt was on the show, we were talking about the timeline of this. And Matt said something very interesting, which was that he was confident that there would not be a Rafah operation before the election.
There's a Frappuccino bet on this. This is how
right.
Very serious.
But they, Matt and John were talking about originally, a sort of side point to this, which was the response. Will there be a response to Iran and the barrage over the weekend, and what will that response be? And it got folded into both Rafah and Iran. And I thought that was interesting to hear him say that he didn't expect a Rafah operation before the election because the clock, as Abe mentions, is if we are looking that many months ahead and this is frozen in place where we are now, it doesn't stay frozen in place in America. The politics of it doesn't stay frozen in place. Right. I mentioned the other day, Alyssa Slotkin, who is a representative in Michigan, Democratic congresswoman in Michigan. She's Jewish, and she is running for Senate. She is going to be the Democratic nominee for Senate in what will probably be a pretty competitive Senate race in Michigan, and therefore a very important one, considering that the state is important also to the Electoral College count, and it's a presidential year. And she has kind of backed off a lot of the pro-Israel stuff she might have been. Alyssa Slotkin was, by the way, one of those who were furious at the squad for the defund the police stuff, because she was saying, you're losing Michigan from your stupid office in New York City. Yeah. You're losing Michigan. You whatever you think out there in San Francisco and all these other places. So, and she has to, and then when I mentioned that the other day, somebody sent me the link to Gretchen Whitmer's interview over the weekend. Gretchen Whitmer is the governor of Michigan. She has been talked about as a rising Democratic star, the next generation politicians, maybe somebody who should have been on the VP list, blah, 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 all that stuff. And she says, and she was on NBC, and they said, is a genocide happening in Gaza? And she said, well, I'm not going to weigh in on that. And so there's a trickle down effect, which is if you are the governor of a state like that, and you have these protests going on, and you won't say, no, I don't think it's a genocide. I mean, for all of Biden's weaknesses on this issue and on the rhetoric issue, he will at least say, no, it's not a genocide. And John Kirby will go out there and say, there's no evidence it's a genocide. Everything that's bad is not necessarily genocide. It's like this basic common sense. If Gretchen Whitmer, who is seen as the next generation of not squad related, not fringe people, a governor of a hugely important state, won't say, no, it's genocide, the trickle-down effect of Biden's leadership on this is clear, which is that every step down, it gets worse until you get to the elected Democrats who are walking around saying there's a genocide.
Okay, I want to talk about Slotkin for a second, because this is important. It gets to the anti-Semitism question. So Slotkin, remember, famously, Michigan is the only state in the country in which Muslims outnumber Jews. So there are 400,000 Muslims. There are 275,000 Jews. So there is a concern electorally that, if you get crosswise of the Muslim community, you're in deep trouble, right? Because there's the 400,000. It's a state, I think the population is 11 million, so 400,000 really isn't a big number, but yes, in a close election, if you lose all 400,000 of them, you're in trouble. But let me just, as we say, talk tachlis for a minute. Melissa Slotkin is a Jewish woman who worked for the CIA as an intelligence analyst. You think the Arabs of Dearborn are going to vote for her under any circumstances? I mean, I'm not saying they're going to vote for John James, whoever is the Republican nominee, but let's just be fair about who we're talking about here. They're not making a prudent calculation about whether or not to vote for a Jew. They're not going to vote for a Jew, and she should know that and write it off and go hard into Birmingham and those those Jewish suburbs outside Detroit and say, you want the next senator from this state to be beholden to the Arabs of Dearborn? Is that what you want? You want the vote on matters not only relating to Israel, but on questions of the treatment of the Jewish people in the United States to be decided in this way? I need your money. I need your vote. I need you to organize for me. I need 90% of the Jewish community in this state to vote for me, or I'm not going to get elected. And then you are going to reap the whirlwind. You're going to have a senator who is effectively on the side of the anti-Semites. Again, we don't even have to talk about Israel here. This is the culture religious war breaking out. And for some reason, Democrats think that they can avoid it or stay on the sidelines, and they can't. And if they don't do it now, they're going to have to do it later, and they're going to be in a much worse position. Michigan is just a test case of this, because it is actually a place where you're going to have to take some risks or show some courage or show some inventiveness to deal with this problem, which is exactly what the Biden administration has been trying and failing to do, in figuring out some kind of middle ground so that they won't be hated by the Arabs of Dearborn, Michigan. Well, guess what? Again, it's not just Biden is there and all that. Biden's Secretary of State is a Jew. His Secretary of the Treasury is a Jew. You think people in those, in the Arab language, in the sort of, Arabic language papers that are circulating around Michigan don't talk about the Jews running Biden? Of course they talk. Ron Klain, a Jew, not running Biden's White House right now, but the first 2 years. Like, they are playing with people who do not want to play with them, who want to kill them and want to kill us. And that is demented. I understand the political impulse to play political games. Biden is not a very good politician. He was a senator from a tiny state that he dominated for almost, for 40 some odd years, then, or 35 years or something like that. Then he was a bad politician as vice president, and he had this one inspired idea about how to run in 2019, 2020. And ever since, what has he done? He's gone from 54% approval to approval in the 30s over 3 years. He's bad at this, and his people are bad at this, and they are now showing it in these circumstances. And the same thing attaches here. Americans do not like Iran. And, when people don't like Iran, and you strike Iran, and you're part of a force that sort of hits Iranian missiles and downs them, and you are the ally of the country that Iran wants to destroy, an inventive politician who has interesting ideas about how to secure support would lean in to anti-Iranian sentiment, would try to turn that in his favor, to be tough, to be resolute, to be, pro-American, anti-totalitarian, anti-regime that hangs gay people from cranes and is once again, as of yesterday, dragging dozens of girls off the street into morality police cars and beating them senseless. That's a political opportunity for Biden, and he is screwing it up yet again because he thinks that he needs to lean on Israel. So let's turn to Israel. So it looks like Israel is preparing a very serious retaliatory measure against Iran, and that they didn't have it ready off the shelf, and they're debating how big or how small or whatever. But I do think that it's pretty fair to say that, given the way everyone in Israel is talking, this idea that they're just going to do something piecemeal, that will create such a blowback inside the country that it could actually take down Bibi Netanyahu's government if it looks like they shot back with a pop gun. Seth? Are you?
Yeah, well,
feeling that also?
I think that there's just a limit to. I think that Bibi Netanyahu doesn't have much of a choice in terms of how he needs to respond, in part because of what we talked about yesterday and the Iraq and the Scuds and all that stuff. People died in the Scud attacks in 1991, and Shamir didn't respond or hit back. And, that was something that is, even if you could understand it, was just not something an Israeli prime minister could survive. And I think that Bibi is, although the attacks on Saturday night didn't have that effect, thankfully nobody was killed. I think that there is a real limit to what citizens of any country will sit there and take. Again, I mentioned the other day the concept of free shots. I hate this concept of free shots, which is what it's sort of looking like with Iran. If they don't kill anybody, they can swing away. I don't think the Israeli people, I don't get the sense from the Israeli people, from those I know, those I talk to, either in the government or in the public, that they feel that way at all, that there's any sort of no punishment for attempted murder mentality among the Israeli people. It's a completely different society in those terms, because it is surrounded by enemies, because it has to survive, because it is young enough as a modern state that the memory is long, right? Bibi Netanyahu is the first Israeli prime minister to have been born in the modern state of Israel, right? He was born in 1949. Mm-hmm. The other prime ministers before him were born before the state. Right. This is like Alaska and, Ted Stevens and those guys. So that's how recent a lot of this is. Everybody's memory is hooked in because they all remember in each generation these wars that happened. It's Israel has been alive for a lifetime, a human, life expectancy. Israel is almost as old as a human life expectancy. And so that's everybody's memory. Nobody's forgotten all these things. And so it's not just that people now look back and say, oh, remember when this happened? What I'm saying is that it has shaped the society into a different type of society. They don't think the way that we think, and people in other countries haven't had to deal with that thing.
Right. And it is important, again, the distortion effect of the media in the United States is that the media in the United States, particularly the American media that have spent time in Israel as bureau chiefs and think people like that, can sort themselves socially and personally with people whose opinions in Israel form electorally about 3% of Israel's electorate. They are overwhelmingly directed in their views and opinions by the writings of people in Haaretz, a paper that I believe has 15,000 subscribers in Israel. It is the smallest, least read of the papers in Hebrew in Israel. This is a tiny rump of people who believe stuff that then comes to have a disproportionate influence on the way American journalists report on this stuff. Israelis are 90% in favor of going into Rafah, and the first number that I saw after Saturday night was they are 2/3 of them want a major response against Iran, and like 20% think they should leave it alone, and then others don't have an opinion. Where that number is today, or whether that was an accurate poll or not, we still have overwhelming support. And there's this idea they have to do one or the other. Maybe they can't do Rafah and Iran at the same time, or they can't do this, and maybe they need to focus on one and not the other. And I say bullshit. Again, politically, you can walk and chew gum at the same time. Iran is an air offensive, and Rafah is a ground offensive, and they are going to do both at the same time in some fashion or other. I mean, I think they're going to do Iran.
And they've been saying about. Remember, they've been saying, Gantz has been saying all this time, Benny Gantz, part of the war cabinet, has been saying all this time, if we need to do Lebanon, we'll do Lebanon too.
And that's right.
For the same thing that you're saying now. He's been saying, we could do two things at the same time. If we have to, we can defend ourselves in the north. Israel
has, with reservists and active duty members of the military, 450,000 people at arms, in theory. Can they do Rafah, Lebanon, and Iran at the same time? Actually, they could. That's why they have 350,000 reservists and a standing army of 100,000 in a nation of 9 million people, because they are the democratic Sparta. They have to be. They have no choice. It's the neighborhood. And with all due respect to my friend and commentary contributing editor Brett Stevens saying revenge against Iran is a dish best served cold. No, it isn't. It is not. It is not best served cold. That is not the way it works. They struck at Israel's territory. They sent cruise missiles and ballistic missiles at Israel. Israel has to respond, and it has to be a real response. Otherwise, as many people have been saying, deterrence against Iran, what happened in the last 2 weeks is that deterrence against Iran has failed. Deterrence against Iran has a huge, arsenal, and Israel keeps killing scientists and doing this and doing that. And Iran has not responded militarily against Israeli soil until now because it was deterred. And that deterrence broke down, and they have to reestablish it, just like they have to reestablish it in Gaza. And if they strike assets of Iran elsewhere, it's not proportionate. It's, they keep saying the Israeli attack has to be not disproportionate. Anything that doesn't involve striking directly at Iran's territory is not proportionate in the other direction. It means that Iran's attack was disproportionate and Israel's response was too weak. So
and it puts Israel at an interesting sort of disadvantage in the public square, in that Israel's attacks on Iranian territory tend to be much more secretive and with plausible deniability because they are, they send in the Mossad to get all those. Remember when they got
but
all
they're
those
not
records?
military attacks. They're not military attacks. They're assassinations.
Right. Well, that's what I'm saying. They're used to being able. They're used to having a fuller menu of things to do to torment the Iranians over their nuclear program, and now they're in a situation where people have to see it happen.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly.
and
That's
also
exactly well put, that they have to see it.
Because also Israelis can't live this way unless there's a big, effective response soon. You can't have the country living under the possibility of a missile barrage at any second now. That you have to change that possibility.
I mean, so we'll see what happens. What's interesting is that all we see are these leaks. Senior official says America thinks that Israel is going to strike ancillary targets, not Iran directly. Or a senior American official says this, or a senior Israeli official says that, and it's all crap because they clearly haven't yet determined the size of the response or the location of the response, right? There's the question of whether they attack the Iranian nuclear sites or whether they do some form of, I mean, we don't even know. We don't know what they have 100 different plans. They've spent nothing over the last 10 years but making plans for how they might have to attack Iran. They don't have too few, they have too many, and they have too many options, and they have too many risk assessments, and they have to go through them pretty systematically to figure out which one, like Goldilocks is, one's too warm, one's going to be too cold. They're looking for the one that's just right.
It's going to be a real test of Biden's claim of ironclad support too, and the international community's reaction will be worth watching here. If Israel successfully strikes within Iran, you can well imagine what the UN's reaction will be. It won't be to scramble, and I think it's very telling, the international reaction now. I mean, Israel's trying to get IRCG called a terrorist group. Like this, there are some important things with regard to sanctions and international pressure that should immediately have happened in the wake of one UN member state attacking another. That has not really gotten a lot of attention this week and should.
Yeah, look, I think it's fair for me to say, if I can, that I do not come on this podcast and talk about my own writings, exclusively to the, exclusion of other things. And I'm now going to mention the piece that I've written for the May issue of Commentary, Israel's Splendid Isolation. Again, I mentioned it yesterday, but there was a detail that I did not put in there that I looked up yesterday about the international community and its response to Israel's aggressive actions abroad, and how this is a constant for Israel. It is constantly condemned when it does, when it commits acts of, offense against its enemies militarily. And I'm just going to read this to you, okay? And this has happened throughout its career, happened, in 1956 in the Sinai, happened in 73, happened just all, whatever, happens all the time. Quote, this is from the New York Times. The Security Council voted unanimously today to strongly condemn Israel's raid on an Iraqi nuclear reactor, as the United States charged that the attack undercut Middle East peace efforts. So guess what? This piece is from June 19th, 1981, 43 years ago. Now listen to the next paragraphs. U.S. Ambassador Jean Kirkpatrick, speaking just before the 15-0 vote. Jean Kirkpatrick, author of Dictatorships and Double Standards, one of the most important essays ever published in Commentary. Ronald Reagan's UN ambassador said the destruction of the Osirak reactor near Baghdad on June 7th was, quote, shocking, unquote, because, quote, diplomatic means available to Israel had not been exhausted. In the sharpest public rebuke to the Israelis yet heard from the Reagan administration, Kirkpatrick equated the raid with the brutal Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the shocking violence of the occupation of Chad by Libya. Jean Kirkpatrick said,
not a squish. Let's just say.
said that Israel's destruction of Saddam Hussein's nuclear reactor was on a par with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Israel should do whatever it needs to do. That's that story, because 42 years later, is there anybody on this planet except Trita Parsi, or I don't know, Trita Parsi loves Iran, so I don't know what he would say about it. Is there anybody who thinks that the destruction of the Osiris reactor wasn't a net positive to the planet Earth? Is there anyone who believes that Saddam Hussein should have had nuclear weapons or nuclear grade material by 1987? So Israel should do whatever it needs to do in Iran, and there will be condemnations, and the UN Security Council will do this, and this one will say that, and everyone will say Israel's isolated and Israel's alone. And 30 years from now, when the mullahs are gone and Iran is a functioning democracy, what Israel does in these next days or weeks will be viewed as some effort, as some milestone on the road to that change.
People have learned that lesson. Just to put it this way, in 91, Dick Cheney was the Secretary of Defense when the Bush administration was warding Israel off from responding and all that. And in I guess it was 2000, was it 2007? The attack on the Syrian, the budding reactor in Syria. Dick Cheney was the vice president, and he was very thankful for the Israeli efforts.
Dick, there was a question about whether or not the United States should participate in the effort to destroy the Syrian nuclear reactor. Article published by Elliot Abrams in commentary delineates this, and that Elliot himself inside argued that it was very important for Israel to do this alone, because it's the nation that needed to establish deterrence against Syria and needed to deter that was a very important way station, and that the United States need not participate. That's right. So, 16 years later, Dick Cheney is saying, don't you do anything, and the world changes and opinion changes, and Israel does know that. And Bibi, as a revisionist, as a follower of Jabotinsky and all that, knows that, but he's also extraordinarily cautious. This is Seth, you've been writing about this in commentary about Bibi and his cautiousness for close to 15 years. And it remains the case that people think that he's some sort of psychotic freak cowboy. And in fact, it's likely that in the councils of power that are going on right now, Bibi is the squish, and that others are arguing for a more forceful response to Iran. And he's looking for, again, some kind of Goldilocks solution where he can keep Biden and Blinken and Sullivan off his ass. And, I don't think he can, so he should probably stop worrying about it, but that's his nature.
Right. As a politician, he's a what people in Israel and in the American government are bothered by with Bibi is the same thing that they forget about Bibi when it comes to this stuff, which is that he's a political operator of the highest caliber, that he's clever, that he knows that he's playing this chess game, and the chess game is the political chess game, and that's what he does. And so he's not the defense establishment guy. And every time he brings in a defense minister, that defense minister usually tries to push him to be more aggressive. Ehud Barak was, one example I mentioned the other day. He was when Barak, was being pushed out of the Labor Party. He joined Bibi's coalition in, I guess it was 2009 after that, and briefly with he had 4 seats or something. He took a faction of them and they joined Bibi, became defense minister, and you had this Bibi Barak brief alliance. Barak was, I think, one of Bibi's commanders at some point in special forces. They have this relationship going back, but Barak was always sort of the hawk figure among the two of them. And Barak was the one who was pushing for an attack on Iran, and Barak's push for it was what led essentially Obama to send to do some sort of military exercise in the Middle East, knowing that Israel won't attack Iran if American troops are out in the Mediterranean running around or something like that. But it was always the other guy that they needed to deter. You go back to Clinton, and Clinton used to say, the guy causing problems is this Ariel Sharon. He's the extremist in the cabinet.
Yeah, it's always somebody.
It's been that way for a very long time, and so they forget this, but they remember it when they complain about Bibi politically. When they say, he's manipulative, he's doing this, he's playing games, he thinks he knows everything, he's playing sides off each other. All this political stuff is from exactly the same root and branch that makes him skeptical of overwhelming military intervention if he thinks it doesn't necessarily have to be done. And, as we said yesterday, they brought in all the opposition figures, to talk to them about it.
I don't think it happened.
Lieberman,
in the end, I don't think it happened. Yeah.
Avigdor Lieberman is one of them. Avigdor Lieberman has resigned probably twice from Bibi governments over Bibi's refusal to invade Gaza. So, yeah.
Yeah. So, look, anyway, Israel's going to move. It clearly made a mistake, I think, not moving on Rafah earlier, unless it was unable to. We just don't know what the circumstances are, whether, the sort of the condition of the hostage. There are various things that could have kept them from it. That if they'd gone into Rafah, Iran wouldn't have struck. There's all sorts of things. Like, this is the thing when you start doing these weird go back in time and try to figure out what might or might not have happened. We don't know what prevented them from the offensive on Rafah. We do know, by the way, that I believe the claim is now that there are no more than 20 hostages alive, it seems, or they're in the humanitarian category, which are, the non-combatants. It's almost impossible to believe that they've kept the combatants alive, by the way, like when you think about it. And at some point, Jewish law, Israeli tradition, it would involve ransoming for the bodies of the hostages, not just for the lives of the hostages. But since Iran, Gaza, Hamas has now refused the sixth ceasefire offer in 5 weeks from Israel. They can't go on like this. Like it's done already. America said, this is my favorite headline. I know we're going on too long and I'm being too dilatory, but I just want to read the headline in the Times of Israel right now about this. U.S. accuses Hamas of being, quote, obstacle, unquote, to Gaza truce after it rejected Israel's proposal. I mean, can you believe it? Hamas is an obstacle to a Gaza truce?
They're rude, very rude.
I mean, that is just, I expected so much more of them. I mean, I don't even know why you would use that word. Like, why are you, anyway. We have not parceled out a recommends for today. So I guess because we are very undisciplined and disorganized here, actually, and we don't set these things up ahead of time. So we're not going to have one. We're actually running along anyway. So you're going to have to go back to our, the Joseph Epstein recommendation from Matt Continetti, or my recommendation of Satan and Gore by Isaac Bashevis Singer.
Or read Dictatorships and Double Standards.
Yeah, go read Dictatorships and Double Standards by Gene Kirkpatrick. Just Google it and commentary. And then remember that Jean, who is a very beloved person to me, when she was in government, as often happens with people in government, betrayed her own good sense in following the Reagan administration's decision to say that the bombing of a nuclear reactor in the hands of Saddam Hussein was the equivalent of the brutal invasion of Afghanistan. And remember that people use rhetoric about Israel that they would never use. Even friends of Israel, even beloved friends of Israel, feel free to use rhetoric about Israel that no one would ever use about any other country. And that was true then. It will be true after the Iran attack, and Israel and friends of Israel and everybody listening to me should remember not to care. Do not care. It does not matter. We'll be be back tomorrow. For Christine, Abe, and Seth, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.